The one of the things that we've been talking about in our session this time on Romans is in Romans chapter 3 and verse 9 says, "What then? Are we better? Not at all, for we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they are all under sin." In this session, you will see that we talk a lot about different translations, and we talk about how the King James Version has translated this as Gentiles. And there have been some questions still about the Jew, the Greek, and the Gentile, and then why is it that some translations are translating the same word as Greek and Gentile in various passages? And so I thought what we would do is we would talk just a few minutes again about the translations, and then we'll talk a little bit about how the Gospel of John, the Book of Acts, all relate to understanding what Paul is meaning when he writes to Jews and Greeks, and then later in Romans to the Gentiles. To talk about, right? There are word for word translations that try to stay as close as they can to the original Greek and Hebrew. Then there are translations which are more thought for thought, trying to convey the meaning of the passage, which is really the main goal of the translation anyway. There's no sense in translating something from one language to another without conveying meaning, and so that's very important. And so, I mean, what good would it do if we translated something in another language from English, and all we did is try to keep the same word order and the same words as we have in English? And that's not even possible when you're translating from most of the time from one language to another. When the King James translators translated the King James, they did it so that it could be understood by the common person, the common man in society. And so there's nothing wrong with conveying thought for thought. And so then what we get into is, how do we translate the words that are in the original? For example, if we were to translate the word baptizo, it means to immerse. That's literally what the word means. But what has happened so much in our translations is that they have translated it as baptized. So they've changed baptizo to baptize, and so it's a transliteration, and it doesn't convey the real meaning of the word. The meaning of the word is to immerse, and so that's why you have some denominations sprinkling, others immersing, others pouring, that kind of thing. So it's an interesting thing when you try to convey the meaning of words from one language into another language. And that's kind of where we are with this Jew, Gentile, and Greek situation that we find ourselves in. Now, in the early church, when the Protestant Reformation occurred, and that's at the time translations began to be translated into the common language of the people, into English and so forth. The Reformation was very influential in those early translations, which you'll see in our session. And one of the things that was very prominent in that time was that the reformers, a lot of the reformers, believed that God had turned from the Jewish people to the Gentile people, and that now there's no longer the promises to the Jewish nation, to the Israelites, but now it's been given to the church, and that God had turned from the Jewish people. And it's called replacement theology. And we're going to be spending some time in future sessions talking about that. And so that mindset, that interpretation, that opinion, presupposition, found its way into some translations. And so whenever they were to read the word for Greek, they would put Gentile there. God has turned from the Jews to the Gentiles. But the context, the precise context of each of these places where the word is used, it doesn't always mean Gentiles. It could mean Gentiles in some locations, but almost in every location it means Greek or Greek-speaking Jews. And we've spent some time talking about this, and But I felt like because of the questions and because of the interest in this, that we would talk about it a little bit more, and that maybe I could use some other places in the New Testament to demonstrate and illustrate what we mean by that. So, in this particular session, we are finding ourselves in the Gospel of John. And what John does is he writes about two different groups of people, basically, that Jesus came to. Remember, Paul said in our passage that we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they're all under sin. And earlier in verse 16 of chapter 1, he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it's the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also the Greek. And you're going to see here in a minute how the King James uses Greek in one passage, but then changes it to Gentile in another passage. And that's part of interpretation. They would look at that particular passage and interpret it to mean that Paul is meaning that it's to the Gentiles. But yet they translate it as Greek in almost every other place, except in some of these places in Romans and First Corinthians, I believe it is, when Paul uses the word. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we cover that particular part of the Greek. So when we talk about the Gospel of John and how the word is used in John, well, there's a distinction between Jews, which are Judeans, and the other Jews, the Jews of the dispersion, diaspora, which would include Greek-speaking Jews, those of the northern kingdom, those that never came back. After the Babylonian captivity, they decided to remain outside of Jerusalem and Judea. And so those that are in the Gospel of John, when it mentions Jews, those are in particular the people of Jesus. He was born in Bethlehem of Judea. He was a Judean. And so this session and the next session, we're going to talk about that in more detail. But if you will look in the Gospel of John, he even references Greeks there, and he's talking about the Greek-speaking Jews, the Hellenists, and so those are people on the other side of the Jordan, the Transjordan people that Jesus goes to. He'll go to them, and he performs miracles and teaches about the kingdom there, and he's received more readily than he is in Jerusalem and Judea. He said a prophet is not received in his own country. He came to his own place, and his own people did not receive him. And his own people are Judeans. They are the Jews. And then within the Jewish people, the leaders of the Jewish people, the scribes and the Pharisees, they're the ones that wanted to stone him. They wanted to crucify him. And so even some Jews, even some Judeans received Jesus, but not like in Galilee, not like in Samaria. And so we spent some time talking about that. And so what I want to do in this particular time is just kind of draw your attention to the Gospel of John, challenge you to read through the Gospel, and you'll have a little bit of that in our session today. And you'll have a little bit in the rest of it in our session next time. And then we'll go from the Gospel of John into the book of Acts, and we'll talk about how it's used there. When were Christians first when were believers first called Christians? Were they Jewish? Were they Gentile? Were they Greek? Were they the Hellenistic Jews? Hebrew Jews, Hellenistic Jews, or Gentiles? And when you find out when the gospel officially went to the Gentiles, and you put everything chronologically through the gospel or the book of Acts, connect that with the Gospel of John, and then see how Paul uses it in Romans, I think it's pretty clear that in all three of those places, we see that the gospel went first to the Jews, then to the Greeks, the Greek-speaking Jews, and then went to the Gentiles. And so I think that if we're very careful and very precise on how we translate the Gospel of John, think about why even the Gospel of John was written. It was written not just to prove the deity of Christ, but it was also written to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, and he is the Christ, the anointed one, and that is the word used for the Greeks, the Greek-speaking Jews. He is the anointed one. He is the Messiah. He is Jesus. He is the long-awaited one. And not only that, but next time we're going to get into how he has united. He is in the line of David. He is on the throne of David. And we know that when David was king, the two tribes were unified. They're the united kingdom. And then the divided kingdom later came. And it's Jesus, the Messiah that they're long awaiting for, who will unite the two kingdoms together. So it's interesting to look at. It does make a difference in how you look at the scripture and how you interpret it and how you understand how the gospel went from the Jewish people to the whole world. Remember that it's Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then to the other parts of the world. So the Gentiles, you and me, we came last. Jews came first. And then right in the middle, we see Samaria, we see Galilee, we see those that are not classified as Judeans, the Jews who are on the outside, a part of the dispersion. And so that's what I believe that Paul is talking about when he uses the term Greeks. And so if you follow along in the book of Romans, when he gets to the point in Romans chapter 3 and verse 9, where he says, what then? Are we better? Not at all. For we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks, both Hebrew Jews and Hellenistic Jews, that they're all under sin. And then later he tells us that even Gentiles are under sin. The whole world is under sin. And so we can apply it to us. We can apply the promises of the Jewish people to us. But we need to remember that if we're going to understand the meaning and intent of the original authors, we have to be precise. We have to interpret it before we can apply it. And so I think that for so many years and for so long in the history of the church, the idea that God went to the Jews, then to the Gentiles, and they just never really take into consideration who the Greeks might be. And when that happens, you really miss a huge portion of what Paul is talking about, what the Gospel of John was written for in the first place, and then you misunderstand really the chronology of the book of Acts. And so, your salvation doesn't depend on it. Your salvation depends on faith in the Messiah, faith in the Christ, faith in Jesus. But your understanding of the scripture does depend on it. And so I think as we get farther along, this will all make more sense to you. And just one more word on translations. I'm big on accuracy of translation. I'm big on the word for word translations, King James, New King James, New American Standard, ESV. And like I said, I even like the NIV, the older translation of the NIV, not the new one. And those translations you can understand. You can also rest assured that they are accurate in the way that they have represented the original text. And in some cases, it's best to combine several different translations when you're studying, so that you can understand really what the word means. Because if all you ever had was an NIV, or all you ever had was a King James, and you saw those passages which talk about Gentiles, you would have a completely different understanding of that verse and how it's applied in the context of the book or the letter than what you would have normally understood it to be if you had understood it to be Greeks and who the Greeks are as Greek-speaking Jews. So just a point of note there. And so I even like, if I'm going to do a devotional read, I like to read the New Living Translation just to sit down and read it, because it does give some good insights in some places, and other places it kind of misses the mark. But if you want good study material, if you want good study translations, if you stick with those 4, 5, or 6 that we talked about in our session and just now, you'll be fine. But I challenge you to use multiple translations, and I think you'll be fine. So hopefully this will make more sense to you as we study together, understanding that in the Gospel of John, you see the Jews as the Judeans, you see those in Galilee and Samaria and those others as those of the dispersion, those that never came back, and that have been influenced by the culture. In essence, the Greek-speaking Jews who had the Septuagint and those kind of things. Then when you get into Acts, we see where God started first with the gospel, where the apostles were sent. They were sent to the Jews, then to the Greek-speaking Jews, and then they were sent to the Gentiles. And then when you get into Romans, you see that Paul does the same thing in Romans as the gospel was spread. Every time Paul went to preach, he always started in the synagogues, and then he went to the Gentiles. And that's exactly the way that he writes his book of Romans. He first addresses it to the Jews, to the Greeks, and then to the Gentiles. First portion, the first 8 chapters, written primarily to the Jewish people, and also the Greeks there, and then the last part from chapter 9 and all primarily to the Gentiles, referencing back to the Jews. We see how we, the Gentiles, have been grafted in, and now we too are saints and members of the household of God, and we too are now a people of God, and we too have justification and sanctification and glorification and all the things that have been promised to those who believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And so the outcome, the application at the end is all the same, but how we arrive to that outcome, that's a little bit different. So hope this has been a little bit of a clarification for you. We'll come back to this again in a future session. But as we get ready to go into the session, remember these things, take your notes, take your questions, send us your questions, and we'll be happy to answer them in any way we can. So let's take just a few minutes and let's look at some verses, a lot of verses where Hellenus is used. Herlanus is used. And let's kind of see how the King James translates it. And notice that it's pretty consistent in almost all translations. But as we start in John 7:35, notice you see Gentiles translated there in the King James. And then you see in John 12, you also see that, John 12:20, but it's translated as Greeks. And so we're going to see that exact same word, either in the interlinear, the King James New American Standard, how they're translated. There's one where the interlinear translates it as Hellenus. And then you see Greek again. They all agree in Acts. And notice in Acts, it's pretty consistent. In each of those passages there, they all translated as Greeks, even the King James. Almost all the way through in Acts, it's that way. But then when you get into Romans, we start to notice something just a little bit different. Now, in Romans 1, it's translated as Greek, but when you get into chapter 2, it's Gentile. When you get into chapter 3, the King James says Gentile. But then you get into Romans chapter 10, and it says Greek again. And but the others are pretty consistent. Now, we know that the NIV also translates in a lot of places that particular word as Gentiles. There in 1 Corinthians, you're seeing that it's translated as as Gentile as well. So when you think about this, we wonder why maybe the King James might translate it one particular way versus another, and we have seen in our interlinear that in both passages, whether you're looking at Romans 1:16 or you're looking at Romans 3:9, the same word is used there. And so we might ask ourselves why it is that the King James translators may have translated as Gentiles. And in a lot of cases, it has to do with the interpretation of the passage, not anything in particular that different word was used. The word for the ethnos is not used there for nations or Gentiles. And so it is the assumption, the interpretation of the King James translators that it was referring to Gentiles there. And so, but to be consistent and to be precise, it doesn't say Gentiles, it says Greek. And so it's interesting that in Romans is the key place where the King James translators changed that, and it really kind of goes back, I think, to the presupposition, the Protestant, kind of the Reformed presupposition that Paul was writing to Gentiles, and which is exactly what we've been talking about as we've been studying along through the introduction of the book of Romans. And so they can see Greek in other passages, even those in the Gospel of John. They can see it in Acts. But then, for some reason, when we get into Paul's writings, they're thinking that it refers to Gentiles, and we've already referenced that some in our studies, because we know that Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, so there's an assumption that he's writing to Gentiles, that these are Gentiles, not Greek-speaking Jews. And then the baggage that comes with the Reformation of being anti-Semitic. And so when you put that in there, and that God has turned away from the Jews and he's turned to the Gentiles, Paul being an apostle to the Gentiles, then as they're coming across that word, then they're going to say, well, what he means by Greek here is he's speaking about the Gentiles, the Greek-speaking people, Hellenists, and they interpret that in those particular verses as Gentiles, where elsewhere they translate the word. So in these passages, it's seemingly where the King James translators have translated Gentiles, that's more of an interpretation than a translation. But where they translate it as Greek, they're consistent with the rest of the translators of other translations, most other translations, and they actually translate it as Greek, and they leave the interpretation based on the person doing the reading and the study. So it's just interesting that I thought it would be important to point out that we have to be careful sometimes. Whether we want to just kind of gloss over it, or if you want to get into detail. And then sometimes our doctrine, our modern day doctrine, is based on the interpretation of the translators, and not so much on the knowledge of the context, the situational context, the cultural context, the grammatical context, the original languages, or the intent of the author. So we sometimes have to be careful when we're applying and interpreting passages just simply based on one or two translations. So let's go now into our session, and let's begin in Romans chapter 3, verse 9, and then we will kind of see how all this ties in together.